Stay late or miss the recital, it's your choice, but the board comes first. The maintenance worker missed his daughter's recital for work. The executive floor demanded overtime while his child waited under stage lights, fingers trembling over polished ivory keys. He didn't argue. He stayed, silent and steady. But someone else sat in his empty seat that night. This is about power noticing what it usually ignores. Before I show you the exact moment when the CEO walked into that school auditorium and chose his chair, by the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. Beneath the surface, this wasn't about overtime or a broken system panel. It was about a promise a father made, and the cost of breaking it. The hum of fluorescent lights vibrated above Daniel Mercer's head as he tightened the last bolt inside the climate control panel. He worked in the narrow service corridor where carpet turned to concrete and framed awards gave way to exposed pipes. His uniform carried the faint scent of machine oil and lemon disinfectant. Upstairs, executives debated numbers that would shape markets. Down here, he kept their air breathable. He checked his phone again. 7 missed notifications from Lila. A photo of the auditorium stage. A final message, "It's okay, Dad. I know you're busy." That sentence hit harder than any reprimand ever could. Daniel didn't swear. He didn't slam tools into the metal cart. He finished the repair with the same quiet precision he always used. When Victor Klein had cornered him earlier, cufflinks glinting under recessed lighting, the choice had been delivered like a courtesy instead of a command. "We can't have the environmental system fail during a board review," the CFO had said. "You're needed. Surely your daughter will understand. Surely." The service elevator rattled as he sent it upward with a diagnostic override that shaved 20 minutes off the projected delay. Most maintenance techs wouldn't have known the bypass existed. He'd memorized the schematics of this building in weeks, understanding load distribution, redundancy loops, structural stress points. Systems spoke to him. They always had. Upstairs, the boardroom lights glowed through frosted glass like a second sunrise. Voices overlapped, controlled, urgent, expensive. Daniel stepped inside just long enough to confirm the airflow had stabilized. Cold air brushed against tailored suits. A few executives barely glanced at him. One muttered thanks without eye contact. Victor did look at him, though. His gaze flicked to the grease at Daniel's cuff. "All good?" "Yes," Daniel replied calmly. "You won't lose pressure during the presentation." The CFO gave a tight nod, already turning away. The dismissal was efficient. He rode the elevator back down, the metallic scent of cables and dust surrounding him. In his pocket, his phone vibrated again. Another message from Leela. Just a single piano emoji. The recital would be starting. He leaned against the cool steel wall and closed his eyes for one measured breath. He had made a promise after his wife died that no matter how thin their life stretched, he would show up. Tonight, he hadn't. What Daniel didn't know was that 2 floors above, behind the tinted glass of a corner office, Evelyn Harrow had overheard more than Victor intended. She had caught the phrase recital drifting through the hallway before the board assembled. Later, a facilities report on her tablet displayed the name assigned to the emergency repair, Mercer D. She noticed details most leaders missed. A father asking to leave early on a critical day. A CFO dismissing it without pause. Across town, the elementary school auditorium filled with parents adjusting camera angles and whispering encouragement. Programs rustled like restless wings. An empty seat near the aisle bore a handwritten tag, Lila Mercer, guest. The stage lights warmed the curtain. Children lined up backstage, nerves buzzing like electricity. Lila smoothed the hem of her blue dress and scanned the crowd one last time. She didn't see him. The building where Daniel worked shimmered against the evening skyline, glass reflecting the fading sun. From the executive lounge, the city looked orderly, obedient. From the maintenance corridor, it felt distant. He returned to his rounds, checking valves, logging pressure levels, ensuring the system wouldn't falter again. If he couldn't sit in that auditorium, he would at least finish what had kept him away. That was the only control he had left tonight. Above him, in a quiet office, Evelyn Harrow picked up her coat. She paused only once at the facilities log before pressing the elevator button herself. Daniel never saw her leave. He only heard the faint echo of the lift descending, unaware that somewhere across the city, a seat bearing his absence was about to be filled. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Evelyn Harrow stepped into the night air without an escort. She wasn't dressed for an elementary school auditorium. Her tailored charcoal coat fell perfectly over a silk blouse that still carried the faint scent of boardroom coffee. The driver moved to follow, but she shook her head. "It's 10 minutes," she said quietly. "I'll handle it." Traffic lights blurred against the windshield as the city shifted from glass towers to brick storefronts and narrow streets lined with parked sedans. She reviewed the name again on her phone. Lila Mercer. Maintenance Department. Emergency climate repair. Missed recital. The school parking lot was crowded, uneven gravel crunching under polished heels. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed above rows of folding chairs. Parents clutched bouquets and camcorders. The air smelled faintly of popcorn and floor polish. She spotted the seat almost immediately. A small white card taped to the backrest read in careful handwriting. Reserved, Lila's dad. For a moment, Evelyn stood there, aware of the weight of her own presence. She was used to commanding rooms, to silence falling when she entered. Here, no one recognized her. She was just another late parent slipping into a metal chair. She sat down. On stage, the curtain parted. Children walked out in uneven lines, shoes squeaking softly against polished wood. Lila appeared near the center, her blue dress catching the light. She scanned the audience again, hope flickering, then dimming, until she saw the empty seat wasn't empty. Confusion crossed her small face, then curiosity. The CEO offered a small, steady nod, the kind that says, "I'm here. Play." Lila straightened. Back at the tower, Daniel tightened the last valve and wiped his hands on a folded rag. The mechanical room echoed with the low thrum of stabilized airflow. His phone vibrated again. He hesitated before looking, bracing for another brave little message meant to protect him from guilt. Instead, there was a photo. It wasn't from his daughter. It was from an unknown number. A picture of Lila at the piano. And in the corner of the frame, unmistakable even beneath auditorium lighting, sat Evelyn Harrow. He stared at the screen, pulse stalling. Another message followed. "She's remarkable. You'd be proud. No signature. None needed." The rag slipped from his fingers. Upstairs, Victor paced near the boardroom windows, irritation etched into the line of his jaw. "We can't afford instability right now," he muttered to an analyst. "One disruption and the acquisition falls apart." Below them, Daniel leaned against the cool cement wall. She went? The CEO of Harrow Biotech left a live board session to sit in a folding chair at a public school? On stage, the first notes floated out, hesitant at first, then steady. Lila's fingers moved with deliberate care. The melody filled the auditorium, soft but unwavering. Evelyn felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. She thought about the maintenance request, the way Victor had dismissed it as if fatherhood were a minor scheduling inconvenience. Around her, parents recorded proudly. No one whispered about quarterly margins or market volatility. The stakes here were simpler. Show up, clap loudly, make your child feel seen. Halfway through the piece, Leela relaxed into the rhythm. Her confidence bloomed under stage lights. When the final chord rang out, applause surged through the room like a wave. Evelyn stood with the others, clapping with genuine force. She texted one final message before slipping out during the next performance. "We'll talk tomorrow." In the mechanical room, Daniel read those words twice. He didn't know whether to feel gratitude or dread. The service elevator rattled again as he rode it up for final checks. This time he felt every floor pass beneath him. When the doors opened onto the executive level, the corridor seemed longer than usual, lined with framed innovation awards and photographs of leadership summits. Victor spotted him first. "Everything stable?" "Yes," Daniel replied evenly. "Pressure's consistent across all zones." "Good. We can't have surprises." The word lingered. Daniel nodded once and turned away. He wasn't sure what tomorrow meant, but he understood something had shifted. Power had stepped into a place it rarely looked. If that moment in the auditorium meant what he thought it did, if the CEO had chosen to see what he'd sacrificed, then the imbalance that defined his world might not be as fixed as it once seemed. And if you haven't already, subscribe with the bell on, because what happens when that quiet recognition collides with corporate crisis, you won't want to miss it. In the distance, the city lights flickered against the glass walls of Harrow Biotech, unaware that a simple folding chair had just altered the trajectory of its leadership. Daniel stood alone in the executive corridor long after Victor disappeared back into the boardroom. The carpet up here muted footsteps, swallowed noise, softened everything. Downstairs, concrete floors echoed every shift of weight. Even buildings understood hierarchy. He checked the environmental dashboard one last time. Stable airflow. Balanced humidity. Energy loads optimized. The repair had been more than routine. The override he'd used prevented a cascading failure most techs wouldn't have seen coming. He hadn't mentioned that part. He returned to the service elevator, the metallic scent of cables grounding him. His phone remained warm in his palm. "We'll talk tomorrow." Tomorrow. The word followed him home. By the time he unlocked his apartment door, the night had settled into quiet. Leela sat cross-legged on the couch, recital program folded neatly in her lap. She looked up the moment he entered, eyes searching his face. "You fixed it?" she asked softly. "Yeah," he said, managing a small smile. "It's running smooth now." She hesitated. She came. Daniel froze. "The lady from your building," Leela continued, "the one from the picture on the lobby wall. She sat in your seat." She clapped really loud. A slow exhale escaped him. "She did?" Leela nodded. "She said you'd be proud." The weight in his chest shifted, not lighter but different, more complicated. "I am proud," he said, crouching in front of her. Always, she studied him the way children do when they sense something adults aren't saying. Then she wrapped her arms around his neck. "It's okay, Dad. I knew you'd want to be there." That was the part that hurt. The next morning, the tower felt charged. News of the near environmental failure had circulated overnight. Analysts whispered near espresso machines. Assistants moved faster than usual. The acquisition deal, already fragile, balanced on projections and confidence. Any instability threatened investor trust. Daniel clocked in and reviewed system logs. Something else caught his eye. A data anomaly in the energy distribution tied to the newly integrated subsidiary facility. The override he'd used last night had masked it temporarily, but the underlying architecture was flawed. Load allocation between facilities wasn't synchronized. If the acquisition finalized under current conditions, the system would collapse under peak demand. He leaned closer to the screen. The modeling error wasn't mechanical. It was structural. A miscalculation in supply chain redundancy assumptions. Whoever approved the integration had trusted theoretical efficiency over practical resilience. Upstairs, raised voices bled faintly through ventilation shafts. Victor's tone carried first. "We can't delay the announcement. The market's watching." Another executive countered, "The simulation models are unstable." Daniel wiped his hands on a cloth and stared at the numbers again. He'd built frameworks like this before. Years ago, in glass offices not unlike these, he'd warned boards about aggressive consolidation without layered safeguards. Resilience cost money. Pride resisted it. A younger facilities tech, Marcus, stepped into the room. "You hear what's going on upstairs?" "Some of it," Daniel replied evenly. "They're freaking out. Consultants flew in at dawn. Something about distribution risk." Marcus squinted at the monitor. "You look like you're reading their language." Daniel gave a small shrug. "Systems are systems." Marcus laughed lightly. "Man, sometimes you talk like you used to run this place." He didn't answer. An alert pinged, minor fluctuation in the newly integrated facility. Daniel adjusted parameters subtly, preventing a spike before it registered upstairs. His fingers moved with instinctive precision. Above them, the boardroom doors slammed open. Victor emerged, face tight. He barely acknowledged Daniel as he passed, but Evelyn followed more slowly. Her gaze landed on the maintenance station screens. "You were on shift last night," she said. "Yes. You stabilized the airflow faster than projected. I know the building." Her eyes lingered a fraction longer. "Do you?" It wasn't a question. It was an observation. An assistant rushed toward them. "We've identified inconsistencies in the integration model. The consultants can't trace the root cause." Evelyn's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "We need solutions, not summaries." The assistant nodded and retreated. Daniel felt it then, the shift from contained tension to systemic threat. The flaw in the model wasn't dramatic yet. But it would be. He turned back to the screen. The anomaly pattern was spreading through digital projections. The consultants would chase surface metrics for days. They were looking at symptoms. He was looking at structure. Marcus leaned closer. "You're seeing something, aren't you?" Daniel paused, considering. The last time he'd stepped into a boardroom with data like this, he'd worn a tailored suit and held a title that opened doors automatically. That life had ended the day his wife's hospital monitor flatlined. Now he wore steel-toed boots. Upstairs, the acquisition clock ticked. Evelyn remained in the corridor longer than necessary, watching the maintenance screens reflect faintly in the glass wall. She had sat in a folding chair the night before and witnessed what absence costs. Today, she was witnessing something else. The quiet competence of a manpower rarely consulted. Daniel adjusted another parameter, preventing a secondary cascade. He didn't know yet that within hours, the anomaly would breach containment. And when it did, titles wouldn't matter. Only understanding would. The fluorescent lights hummed steadily above him, unaware that the foundation of a billion-dollar decision was beginning to crack. By mid-morning, the crack had widened. Daniel watched the anomaly ripple through the integration dashboard like a hairline fracture spreading across glass. The system compensated once, then again. The third time, it lagged half a second too long. Upstairs, alarms didn't blare. This wasn't that kind of failure, but tension traveled faster than sound. Assistants moved between offices with clipped urgency. The consultants clustered around digital projections, laser pointers slicing through spreadsheets that grew more unstable by the minute. Marcus exhaled sharply beside him. "That's not good, right?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He zoomed in on the load balancing grid tied to the subsidiary facility. The projections assumed synchronized supplier responsiveness across 3 regions. That assumption only worked in ideal conditions. Markets weren't ideal, people weren't predictable. He adjusted his stance, steel-toed boots scraping faintly against concrete. The override he'd used last night had hidden the stress temporarily. Now the architecture itself was rebelling. A notification flashed across internal systems, Integration Simulation Failure Phase 3. That one would be visible upstairs. The service elevator dinged moments later. Victor stepped out first, irritation sharp enough to cut air. 2 consultants followed, tablets glowing in their hands. "We're seeing irregular distribution patterns in the energy and logistics modeling," one consultant said quickly. "The redundancy assumptions aren't holding under peak acquisition load." Victor ran a hand through his hair. "That's impossible. We paid for triple verification." "Verification of projections," the consultant corrected, "not stress-tested behavioral variables." Daniel felt the urge to nod. He kept still. Evelyn arrived seconds later, posture controlled but eyes alert. She scanned the maintenance monitors before addressing the consultants. "Is this a temporary fluctuation or systemic?" "Systemic," the second consultant admitted. "If we proceed with the announcement under current architecture, we risk operational collapse within the first quarter." Silence settled like weight. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. Daniel's gaze stayed on the screen. The flaw was no longer subtle. It was structural, rooted in aggressive consolidation without layered fail-safes. Efficiency had been prioritized over resilience. Victor noticed Daniel watching the projections. "This isn't your concern," he said curtly. "Stick to facilities." Daniel met his eyes briefly. "Facilities are tied to load distribution." Victor's jaw tightened. "Not at this level." Evelyn didn't interrupt. She watched. Another alert pinged. A secondary facility in the Midwest flagged projected overload under simulated supply delay. The consultant scrambled to recalculate variables, fingers tapping frantically against glass. Daniel stepped closer to the screen without fully entering the conversation. "You're modeling supplier compliance at 98%. One consultant glanced at him, irritated. "Yes, that's standard for this sector. It hasn't been 98% in 3 years," Daniel said evenly. Regional volatility dropped it closer to 89 during peak demand. Victor turned sharply. "And you know this how?" He didn't answer the challenge directly. "If you lower compliance assumptions and reroute redundancy through staggered buffers instead of simultaneous integration, the cascade stabilizes." The consultant frowned, but adjusted the variable almost reflexively, perhaps just to prove him wrong. The projection shifted, not fixed, but less catastrophic. The room stilled. Victor scoffed. "Coincidence?" Daniel folded his arms loosely. "No." Evelyn's gaze sharpened. Run the full simulation under his parameters. The consultants exchanged looks but complied. The model recalibrated. Numbers flickered. Stress indicators decreased marginally. "Where did you learn integration modeling?" one consultant asked, suspicion creeping into his tone. Daniel's expression remained neutral. "Systems talk if you listen." Victor let out a short laugh. "He fixes boilers." "I stabilize systems," Daniel corrected quietly. The distinction hung there. Upstairs, investors were already calling. The acquisition announcement had been scheduled for 48 hours from now. Delaying it would signal weakness. Proceeding blindly could signal incompetence. Evelyn stepped closer to the maintenance station, close enough to see the fine layer of grease along Daniel's knuckles. "If we alter the architecture, as you're suggesting," she said carefully, "how much time do we buy?" "Enough," he replied. "If you're willing to restructure instead of rushing." Victor bristled. "Restructure? Do you have any idea what that implies?" Daniel met his glare steadily. "Yes." For a split second, something unspoken passed between the maintenance corridor and the executive floor, recognition that knowledge doesn't always announce itself with titles. Another alert chimed. The stress indicators climbed again as the full simulation processed. The consultant stepped back from the screen. It's worse than we thought, one murmured. If the market reacts to instability, it will, Evelyn finished quietly. The glass walls of the executive corridor reflected all of them: tailored suits, polished shoes, steel-toed boots, different uniforms, same uncertainty. Daniel inhaled slowly, already calculating alternatives. The flaw wasn't unfixable. It was simply inconvenient to ego. Victor crossed his arms. We'll reconvene upstairs. This isn't the place. Evelyn didn't move immediately. Her attention remained on the recalibrated model and the man standing calmly beside it. You said staggered buffers, she prompted. Yes, show me. Victor's protest caught in his throat. The consultants hesitated, then shifted aside. Daniel stepped fully into the space, fingers hovering over controls he technically wasn't authorized to use. The fracture in the foundation had become visible. Now the question wasn't whether it would spread, it was who would be allowed to repair it. Daniel didn't wait for permission a second time. He adjusted the modeling interface, not with the tentative curiosity of a technician out of place, but with the fluid confidence of someone who understood architecture at its core. The screen's glow reflected in his eyes as he isolated the subsidiary facilities' load inputs and separated them from the aggressive synchronization protocol that had been approved during acquisition talks. You're integrating everything simultaneously, he said, voice steady. That works in theory. It fails in reality. Victor folded his arms tighter. And your solution is? Decouple Phase 3. Create regional buffers that operate independently under stress. You stagger risk instead of concentrating it. One consultant frowned. That reduces short-term efficiency. It increases survivability, Daniel replied. The word settled heavily. Evelyn stepped closer, heels clicking softly against tile. Run it. The consultants obeyed. The simulation recalculated. The cascade slowed. Stress indicators dropped from catastrophic red to volatile amber. Not safe, but stable enough to breathe. Marcus let out a low whistle under his breath. Victor stared at the screen, disbelief tightening his features. This is a temporary bandage. No, Daniel said quietly. It's a structural correction. But it means delaying the announcement and revising the integration narrative. Silence again. Upstairs, phones buzzed with investor inquiries. The acquisition was already priced into projections. Markets punished hesitation. Evelyn's gaze shifted from the data to Daniel. If we don't revise, then you announce growth you can't sustain, he answered. And when the first disruption hits, the collapse will be public. The word public lingered like a warning. Victor exhaled sharply. We can't take strategic advice from maintenance staff. You already are, Evelyn said without looking at him. The temperature in the corridor seemed to change. Daniel stepped back slightly, hands lowering from the controls. He hadn't meant to take over the room. He'd meant to prevent a preventable failure. But now every eye measured him differently. The consultant cleared his throat. If we adopt this staggered buffer approach, we'll need a complete recalibration of logistics modeling. I can outline it, Daniel said before thinking. Victor laughed once, humorless. Of course you can. Evelyn held up a hand, silencing him. How? Daniel hesitated. This was the edge, the point where anonymity could no longer protect him. But the flaw was too clear to ignore. I built frameworks like this before, he said carefully. Years ago, integration stress models, regional volatility mapping. You're assuming supplier elasticity that doesn't exist anymore. The consultant blinked. You? Built them? Daniel nodded once. For larger portfolios than this, Victor's voice sharpened. You expect us to believe you were some kind of what? Executive? Daniel didn't rise to the bait. Believe what you want. The math stands. The simulation completed its run. Amber stabilized. Risk projections flattened into manageable ranges. Marcus leaned closer to Daniel, whispering, "You weren't kidding about systems talking." He offered the faintest hint of a smile. Evelyn studied him openly now. The grease-stained cuffs, the precise terminology, the calm under pressure. It didn't match the file she'd skimmed the night before. "What was your role?" she asked. A beat passed. "Chief Operations Architect," he answered. The corridor seemed to narrow around the words. Victor scoffed instinctively, but uncertainty crept into his expression. "At what firm?" Daniel met his gaze evenly. Mercer Global Logistics. Recognition flickered across one consultant's face. They pioneered decentralized integration after the coastal supply crisis. Daniel didn't confirm. He didn't need to. Evelyn absorbed it silently. The folding chair. The recital. The maintenance log. The anomaly. Pieces aligned with unsettling clarity. "We need a full restructuring plan within 24 hours, she said finally. Victor protested immediately. "That's impossible." "It's necessary," she corrected. Her eyes returned to Daniel. "Can you produce one?" He inhaled slowly. "Yes." The word carried no arrogance, only certainty. Victor shook his head. "You can't just elevate him because he made a lucky guess." "This wasn't luck," Evelyn said, voice sharpening for the first time. "It was competence." A new alert chimed, minor volatility spiked from another region. The consultants moved instinctively, but Daniel was already adjusting variables preemptively, anticipating the ripple before it crested. He didn't look at them as he worked. He looked at the system, because beneath titles and pay grades, beneath polished boardrooms and service corridors, there was structure. And structure obeyed truth, not hierarchy. If you're still watching, subscribe with the bell on, because what happens when this restructuring goes public will change everything. The amber indicators steadied again. Victor stared at the stabilized projection as if it had betrayed him. Evelyn straightened. "We reconvene in the boardroom. All of us." Her gaze lingered on Daniel one fraction longer. "Bring your data." For the first time since the anomaly surfaced, the fracture didn't look inevitable. It looked repairable. And repair, Daniel knew, always revealed who truly understood the foundation. "Bring your data." The words followed him into the service elevator like an echo that didn't belong there. Daniel stood alone as the doors slid shut, fluorescent light flickering above him. His reflection in the brushed steel looked unchanged. Same navy maintenance shirt, same oil-darkened cuffs, same worn boots. But the air felt different. He wasn't riding up to fix a valve this time. He was riding into the boardroom. The elevator hummed upward, each passing floor tightening something low in his chest. Not fear, not exactly. More like memory. When the doors opened, the executive corridor stretched before him, thick carpet-swallowing sound, abstract art lining the walls, glass offices glowing with filtered sunlight. Assistants paused mid-step when they saw him step out alone. Victor was already inside the boardroom, pacing near the wall-length screen. The consultants murmured over updated projections. Evelyn stood at the head of the table, posture composed, hands resting lightly against polished wood. Every chair was filled except one. Daniel didn't hesitate. He entered. Conversation thinned into silence. Victor's eyes dropped immediately to Daniel's uniform. "This is highly irregular," he said. "We have shareholders dialing in." "We also have a structural vulnerability," Evelyn replied evenly. "Irregular is already here." She gestured toward the screen. "Show us." Daniel walked to the console without rushing. The air carried the faint scent of expensive cologne and fresh coffee. Outside the glass walls, the city skyline shimmered in indifferent sunlight. He connected his tablet to the system. The projection shifted from consultant-generated models to a new grid, simpler, cleaner. "You've concentrated risk into a single synchronized integration," he began, voice steady but unforced. "That maximizes short-term valuation optics. It also guarantees collapse under stress." Victor scoffed softly. "Dramatic, accurate," Daniel corrected. He adjusted variables on screen, separating regions into staggered buffers. "Decouple Phase 3. Allow independent operational elasticity. You'll sacrifice immediate efficiency metrics, but you gain resilience." One board member leaned forward. "What's the cost?" "Less than public failure," Daniel said. A flicker of discomfort crossed the table. He expanded the model, overlaying historical volatility patterns. "Supplier compliance hasn't exceeded 90% in volatile quarters since the coastal disruption 3 years ago. Your projections assume 98. A consultant interjected, "That's industry standard." "It's outdated," Daniel replied. "Standards don't adapt fast enough." Victor's jaw tightened. "You're speaking as if you've run integration at scale." Daniel met his gaze directly now. "I have." Silence again. But this time it felt heavier. Evelyn didn't look surprised. "Explain." He tapped the screen once, bringing up an archived framework, one he'd rebuilt from memory over the past hour. Mercer Global Logistics adopted decentralized buffering after simultaneous integration failures across 2 regions. I led the redesign. A murmur rippled around the table. One board member blinked. Mercer Global was acquired for its resilience model. "Yes," Daniel said simply. Victor leaned back slowly, disbelief mixing with irritation. "And somehow you ended up maintaining air ducts." The words were meant to diminish. Daniel didn't flinch. "After my wife died, I left. My daughter needed stability. So I chose work that ended at 5 and didn't follow me home." The room shifted. For a fraction of a second, no one spoke. Evelyn broke the silence. "If we adopt your restructuring, what happens to our acquisition timeline?" "You delay the announcement 48 hours, he said. "Publicly cite integration recalibration for long-term resilience. It signals prudence, not weakness, if you frame it correctly." "And if we don't?" Another board member pressed. Daniel let the projection answer. He toggled back to the original synchronized model and ran a high-stress simulation. Within seconds, red flooded the grid. Projected operational collapse in 2 quarters. Investor confidence plummeting. Media scrutiny escalating. The numbers spoke louder than any title. Victor exhaled sharply. "You're asking us to trust a maintenance technician over our consultants. I'm asking you to trust the math," Daniel said quietly. Evelyn studied the dual projections, the red cascade versus the amber stabilization. Power, she knew, wasn't about always being right. It was about recognizing when someone else was. "Implement the staggered buffer model," she said at last. Victor stiffened. "We can't. We can," she cut in. "And we will." She turned to Daniel. "You'll oversee the recalibration." The words landed like a public shift in gravity. Victor's voice sharpened. "He doesn't even have clearance." "Then grant it," Evelyn replied. Around the table, board members exchanged glances, some hesitant, some intrigued, all aware that something unprecedented was unfolding. Daniel inhaled once, grounding himself. This wasn't about reclaiming an old life. It was about preventing preventable damage to employees, to investors, to families whose paychecks depended on these decisions. He nodded. "We'll need immediate access to regional data feeds." "You'll have it," Evelyn said. Outside the glass walls, employees had begun gathering near the atrium screens, aware that something significant was happening upstairs. Rumors traveled fast in buildings like this. Inside, the projection stabilized under the new model, amber lines flattening into manageable curves. Public collapse had been averted. For now. Victor stared at the screen as if watching authority slip through his fingers. Daniel stepped back from the console, uniform still marked by grease, boots still scuffed from concrete floors. But in this room, surrounded by tailored suits and silent recalculations, the hierarchy had shifted, not because he demanded it, because he understood what they did not, and in front of witnesses who would carry this moment beyond glass walls and into whispered conversations across the building, maintenance had just rewritten strategy. The boardroom remained unnaturally still, as if the air itself were recalibrating. Daniel felt the weight of every gaze, but he didn't shrink from it. He stood near the console, hands relaxed at his sides, watching the staggered buffer model continue to process in steady amber lines. Stability wasn't flashy. It didn't surge with dramatic spikes. It held. Victor was the first to break the silence. "This doesn't make him indispensable," he said, tone clipped. "We hired consultants for a reason." One of those consultants shifted uncomfortably. To be fair, the decentralized buffering aligns with post-crisis best practices. Victor shot him a look sharp enough to cut. Evelyn stepped forward, her heels quiet against the polished floor. "It aligns with survival," she said. "Which is what we need." Daniel didn't interrupt. He knew better than to speak while egos rearranged themselves. A board member leaned back slowly. "If word gets out that a facilities employee corrected our integration model, it won't be framed that way," Evelyn said. "It will be framed as strategic recalibration, led by internal operational expertise." Victor's eyes flicked toward Daniel. Internal expertise that hasn't been disclosed, Daniel met the accusation evenly. "You never asked." The answer wasn't sharp. It was factual. Victor opened his mouth, then closed it again. Outside the glass walls, the executive corridor had grown crowded. Assistants pretended to pass through, but their attention lingered on the boardroom. Something about the atmosphere had changed. People sensed it. Evelyn turned back to Daniel. "Why didn't you apply for an executive role when you joined?" He considered the question before answering. "Because I didn't want one." A faint crease formed between Victor's brows. "You expect us to believe that?" "I wanted predictability," Daniel replied. "After my wife died, my daughter needed consistency more than I needed status. Maintenance shifts end. Board meetings don't." The simplicity of it unsettled the room more than arrogance ever could. One board member cleared her throat. "Your previous firm, Mercer Global Logistics, why leave at the height of its expansion?" "Because expansion doesn't tuck your kid in at night," he said quietly. Silence settled again, but this time it carried something different. Recognition. Victor shifted tactics. "Even if we accept your framework, overseeing recalibration requires authority. You're not on payroll at that level." Evelyn's gaze sharpened. Authority is granted when competence demands it. And what precedent does that set? Victor pressed. "That we value results," she replied. Daniel felt the tension pivot toward something larger than him. This wasn't only about a flawed acquisition anymore. It was about what leadership looked like when stripped of ceremony. The consultant at the far end of the table spoke cautiously. "If we're proceeding with the staggered model, we'll need immediate coordination with regional directors. That announcement has to be carefully structured," Evelyn nodded. "Prepare a revised public statement. Emphasize long-term resilience," Victor exhaled sharply. "The market will interpret delay as weakness only if we appear uncertain," Evelyn said. "We won't." Her eyes flicked back to Daniel. "You'll present the operational rationale." The request shifted the room's gravity again. Victor blinked. "Present? To shareholders? Yes. He's not. He's the architect of the correction, she said calmly. Authenticity reads stronger than spin. Daniel's pulse ticked once, heavy but controlled. He hadn't stepped into this building to reclaim a title. He had stepped into it to fix a structural flaw. Yet here he was, positioned at the center of a narrative that would ripple beyond glass walls. He thought of Leela in the auditorium, of the folding chair, of the quiet way Evelyn had chosen to show up. Public exposure. It wasn't about humiliation. It was about truth becoming visible. Victor leaned forward, voice low, "Be careful what you elevate." Optics cut both ways. Daniel didn't bristle. So does fragility. The words weren't aggressive, they were steady. Evelyn studied them both before speaking. This isn't about elevating anyone, it's about correcting a mistake before it compounds. A soft knock interrupted the tension. An assistant stepped inside, pale. "We're getting inquiries." Analysts noticed volatility in our pre-announcement metrics. The room stiffened. "How long?" Victor asked. "Minutes," she answered. The window for quiet recalibration had closed. Evelyn drew a measured breath. "Then we move now." She turned to Daniel. "Walk me through the revised model one more time. If we're standing in front of investors within the hour, I need to anticipate every question." He nodded once and stepped beside her at the console. As he outlined buffer sequencing and elasticity thresholds, his voice remained even, almost conversational. No flourish, no defensiveness, just clarity. Through the glass walls, employees watched, not because they understood integration modeling, but because they could see something shifting in real time. A maintenance technician standing at the head of the boardroom table, explaining strategy to executives who had once overlooked him. Victor felt it too. The slow erosion of hierarchy under the weight of competence. When Daniel finished, the amber projection held steady. Evelyn straightened. "Prepare the call." Outside, whispers had already begun. Inside, power had quietly changed shape. The boardroom doors opened, and the quiet corridor outside fell into an even deeper silence. Assistants froze mid-step. Analysts pretended to study tablets that weren't displaying anything new. Word had already traveled, something unusual was happening upstairs. Daniel remained near the console as the investor call interface illuminated the main screen. A digital countdown began in the corner, 3 minutes. Victor adjusted his cufflinks, tension visible in the tightness of his jaw. "We keep this concise," he muttered. "No unnecessary detail." Evelyn didn't respond to him. Her focus remained on Daniel. "Walk it cleanly," she said. "Facts. Structure. No defensiveness." He nodded. The countdown reached 1 minute. The city skyline shimmered behind glass walls, sunlight glinting off neighboring towers as if nothing significant were unfolding inside this one. The call connected. Dozens of investor windows filled the screen, familiar faces, calculating eyes. Evelyn opened with controlled authority. "We're announcing a strategic recalibration of our acquisition integration." A ripple of surprise crossed the digital grid. Before speculation could escalate, she continued. "Our internal operational review identified structural vulnerabilities under peak stress conditions. We are implementing a staggered buffer model to ensure long-term resilience." Victor shifted slightly, but said nothing. Then Evelyn did something no one in that room expected. "I'm going to hand this to the architect of that recalibration." She turned to Daniel. For a fraction of a second, the room held its breath. He stepped forward, grease-stained cuffs visible beneath executive lighting. Steel-toed boots grounded on plush carpet. He didn't look like the typical voice of billion-dollar strategy, but when he spoke, his tone carried measured confidence. "Our original integration model concentrated regional risk into synchronized activation," he began. "Under ideal supplier compliance, that performs efficiently. Under volatility, it collapses. The investors leaned closer to their screens. We've decoupled Phase 3 integration, he continued. Each region now operates with independent elasticity thresholds. That reduces short-term efficiency metrics by approximately 3%, but increases survivability under peak stress by 22%. A few eyebrows lifted. Victor folded his hands tightly, watching reactions. An analyst on the call interrupted. "And your role in this recalibration is?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "I oversee system stabilization within this facility. Previously, I designed decentralized integration frameworks for Mercer Global Logistics during the coastal supply crisis." Recognition flickered across more than one face. "You're Daniel Mercer?" one investor asked. "Yes." The tone shifted instantly. Skepticism gave way to recalculation. Mercer Global's resilience model had become case study material in business schools. Daniel continued, unembellished, "We're choosing stability over optics that preserves shareholder value long term." Silence followed, not hostile, but thoughtful. Evelyn stepped in seamlessly. "We believe transparency strengthens confidence. This recalibration ensures durability." Victor cleared his throat, adding controlled commentary about timeline adjustments and projected market response. But the room understood something unspoken. This wasn't damage control. This was correction. As the call progressed, initial volatility metrics stabilized. Investor questions shifted from suspicion to implementation details. The narrative had been reframed, not as weakness but as prudence. Public exposure, not humiliation, recognition. When the call ended, the boardroom remained still for a moment longer. Outside, employees who had been pretending not to watch quickly dispersed. But whispers had already begun spreading through departments. The maintenance tech had just presented to shareholders. Victor exhaled sharply. That was unconventional. "It was effective," Evelyn replied. Daniel stepped back from the table, pulse steady. He hadn't spoken for applause. He'd spoken because collapse would have hurt people who didn't sit in that room, people whose mortgages and medical bills depended on stability. Marcus appeared quietly at the doorway, eyes wide. "That was you on the investor screen, wasn't it?" Daniel offered a faint smile. "Looks like it." "If you're seeing this unfold," Evelyn said suddenly, glancing toward the glass walls, "subscribe with the bell on. Because moments like this change more than balance sheets. They change culture." Victor shot her a look, confused by the phrasing, but she didn't clarify. The message wasn't for him. She turned back to Daniel. "This isn't over. We need internal alignment before rumors distort the narrative." He nodded. Transparency prevents distortion. Again, that simple steadiness. The amber projections remained stable on screen, no longer flashing with volatility. The building itself seemed quieter, as if structural tension had eased. Victor studied Daniel with something closer to calculation now than dismissal. "You've made your point," he said carefully. "But authority structures exist for a reason." Daniel met his gaze without challenge. "So do foundations." The words weren't confrontational, they were structural. Evelyn straightened. "We'll hold a company-wide town hall this afternoon. I want every department present." Victor blinked. "Publicly?" "Yes," she said. "If we corrected this in public, we acknowledge it in public." Daniel felt the next wave building, not financial collapse but cultural shift. And this time it wouldn't be confined to glass walls and investor screens. It would echo through the entire building. The boardroom doors opened again, but this time no one pretended not to look. Word had already outrun explanation. Analysts stood in clusters near the atrium railing below. Assistants whispered with barely concealed curiosity. Even departments far removed from logistics sensed that something foundational had shifted. Daniel walked beside Evelyn toward the central staircase that overlooked the main floor. The building's architecture had always been symbolic. Executive offices elevated above glass balconies, operational teams below. Today, that separation felt thinner. Victor followed a few steps behind, phone pressed to his ear, voice low and controlled. Yes, the recalibration is strategic. No, there's no instability. We're reinforcing resilience. His tone was steady, but tension still threaded through it. Downstairs, large digital displays began streaming the company-wide town hall announcement. Employees gathered in widening circles beneath the suspended screens. The air carried the faint scent of brewed coffee and printer ink. Someone turned off the background music. Evelyn stepped to the balcony edge first. Conversations hushed. Daniel remained slightly behind her, not hiding, not centering himself either. Steel-toed boots planted firmly against polished flooring. Victor ended his call and joined them. Posture rigid. Evelyn's voice carried easily across the open atrium. This morning, we identified and corrected a structural vulnerability within our acquisition integration. A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. We chose recalibration over speed, she continued. Because long-term stability matters more than short-term optics. Employees exchanged glances. That wasn't typical corporate language. Victor stepped forward next, outlining timeline adjustments with careful phrasing. He emphasized strategic prudence, disciplined oversight, executive foresight. His delivery was controlled, but the energy below didn't fully respond. They were waiting. Evelyn didn't keep them waiting long. The recalibration was designed by someone who understands structural resilience at its core, she said, turning slightly. Daniel, all eyes shifted. Whispers sharpened into audible surprise. Daniel stepped forward, not hurried, not reluctant. He felt the weight of visibility settle across his shoulders, but it wasn't heavy. It was clarifying. He looked down at the crowd, people he'd passed in service corridors, analysts who'd never noticed him adjusting thermostats outside conference rooms, security guards who nodded quietly at shift changes. "I'm not here because of a title," he began evenly. "I'm here because the model needed correction." The atrium remained silent. "Our original integration concentrated risk," he continued. "Under ideal conditions, that's efficient. Under stress, it fractures." He paused, letting the metaphor land beyond spreadsheets. "So, we built buffers. Independent elasticity. Staggered activation. It reduces immediate performance metrics slightly, but it protects jobs, operations, and long-term growth." That last phrase changed the air. Protects jobs. Employees straightened subtly. A voice from below called out, hesitant but clear. "You're in maintenance, right?" A few nervous laughs followed. Daniel nodded once. "Yes, and you designed this?" Yes, the honesty was disarming. Victor shifted beside Evelyn, jaw tight. The narrative was slipping from controlled executive framing into something more organic. Another employee spoke up. "Why weren't you in strategy meetings before?" Daniel didn't deflect. "Because no one asked." A ripple of uncomfortable recognition moved through the atrium. Evelyn stepped forward again. "That's on leadership," she said plainly. "We overlooked expertise because it didn't come wrapped in expectation." Victor stiffened at that. Daniel continued, voice steady. "Systems don't care about hierarchy. They respond to structure. When structure's wrong, you fix it." He wasn't preaching, he was explaining. Marcus stood near the front now, arms crossed proudly. "Told you he talked like he ran the place," he muttered to a colleague. On the balcony, Victor leaned toward Evelyn, voice low. "You're turning this into symbolism." "No," she replied quietly. "It already was. Down below, the mood had shifted from confusion to something closer to respect, not dramatic applause, not theatrical celebration, just recognition, public exposure. The truth, once seen, couldn't be unseen. An analyst raised a hand. Does this mean internal mobility changes, that expertise gets evaluated differently? Evelyn answered before Daniel could. Yes, Victor inhaled sharply. We can't rewrite policy in a single afternoon. We can start, she said. Daniel felt the conversation widening beyond integration models. This wasn't just about a corrected acquisition. It was about who got heard. He glanced briefly at the atrium's far wall, where a large frame display featured past executive portraits. Polished smiles, formal poses. He didn't belong in that frame. And he didn't want to. He belonged where systems met reality. Evelyn concluded the town hall with measured authority. We'll circulate revised integration timelines by end of day. Thank you for your adaptability. Applause began slowly, then strengthened. Not explosive, earned. As employees dispersed, many lingered near the staircase, looking up at Daniel differently now. Not as the man who fixed vents, as the one who prevented collapse. Victor remained at the balcony, railing longer than necessary. You've complicated things, he said quietly. Daniel met his gaze. They were already complicated. The building hummed with new energy as conversations flowed through corridors and break rooms, and beneath the glass towers and polished floors, something foundational had shifted again. Not just in the integration model, in who was seen. The atrium slowly emptied, conversations trailing off into conference rooms and cubicles. The energy that remained wasn't chaotic, it was recalibrated. People walked differently, looked at one another longer. Something invisible had been acknowledged out loud. Daniel lingered near the balcony rail, watching the last clusters disperse. Steel and glass reflected his faint outline beside framed executive portraits. He didn't belong on that wall. He knew it, and strangely, he didn't feel diminished by it. Behind him, the board reconvened in the same glass-walled room where the fracture had first been exposed. Close the doors, Victor instructed. They did. The city outside continued moving, oblivious. Inside, the atmosphere shifted from public narrative to private reckoning. Evelyn remained standing at the head of the table. The recalibration has stabilized projections, she began. Investor response is neutral to positive. Volatility metrics are settling. One board member nodded slowly. The transparency helped. Victor folded his hands on the table. It also exposed internal hierarchy gaps. It exposed oversight, Evelyn corrected. His gaze flicked toward Daniel, who had taken a seat at the far end, posture composed but not possessive. Victor leaned forward. You've positioned him as the architect of this correction. That creates expectations. Daniel met his eyes without defensiveness. The model speaks for itself. Yes, Victor replied sharply. But governance matters. So does accuracy, Evelyn interjected. Silence again. A senior board member cleared her throat. Let's address the obvious. If Daniel Mercer designed the stabilization framework and successfully presented it to investors, what role does he hold moving forward? The question hung there, heavier than any integration model. Daniel felt the weight of it but didn't rush to fill it. He hadn't stepped forward for a promotion. He'd stepped forward to prevent damage. Victor answered first. He can consult temporarily. Under supervision. Supervision, Evelyn repeated evenly. From whom? Victor hesitated. The consultant who had earlier recognized Mercer Global's model spoke carefully. With respect, the decentralized buffering aligns almost exactly with Mercer Global's resilience doctrine. Few executives in this sector understand it at that depth. Another board member nodded. We've spent millions hiring external firms for less effective guidance. The truth was assembling itself without theatrics. Evelyn turned to Daniel directly. If you were to formalize oversight of operational resilience here, what would you require? He considered before speaking. Autonomy in structural decisions, transparency across departments, and flexibility. Flexibility? Victor echoed skeptically. Daniel's voice remained calm. My daughter's recital schedule matters more to me than a title. The room shifted again, not with surprise this time, but clarity. Evelyn didn't look away. You'd prioritize family over executive demands, yes, and still safeguard the company? Yes, Victor exhaled sharply. That's not how executive leadership functions. Maybe that's the problem, Daniel replied quietly. The statement wasn't confrontational, it was observational. The board members exchanged glances. Markets rewarded efficiency, but culture rewarded integrity. And today, integrity had preserved value. Evelyn made her decision without dramatics. Effective immediately, she said, Daniel Mercer will assume the role of Director of Operational Resilience. Victor stiffened. That bypasses protocol. It corrects it, she answered. She continued before interruption could build. The position will include structural authority over integration modeling and cross-departmental stabilization. It will also include flexible scheduling parameters. The word flexible landed with deliberate precision. Daniel felt the shift settle into permanence. Victor leaned back slowly, studying the ceiling as if recalculating power lines above him. You're restructuring more than integration. Yes, Evelyn replied. We are. The boardroom grew quiet, not in resistance, but in recognition that a precedent had been set. Public exposure had been step 1. Institutional acknowledgement was step 2. Daniel rose from his seat, not triumphant, not theatrical. If I accept, it's to prevent structural fragility, he said. Not to replace anyone. Victor met his gaze, something unsettled flickering there. You already have. Daniel didn't respond to that. Evelyn extended her hand across the table. He hesitated only a fraction of a second before shaking it. No applause, no dramatic announcement, just a quiet agreement that competence had redefined the room. Outside the glass walls, employees continued their work, unaware that governance itself had shifted in tone. The amber projections on the boardroom screen remained stable, lines steady, curves flattened. The fracture had not only been repaired, it had revealed who understood foundations. And for the first time since he'd walked into this building in steel-toed boots, Daniel wasn't standing at the edge of someone else's structure. He was shaping it. The handshake ended, but its echo lingered in the room. Daniel released Evelyn's hand and stepped back, aware that titles meant nothing if culture refused to follow. The boardroom felt smaller now, less imposing. The glass walls that once separated authority from the rest of the building looked almost fragile. Victor broke the silence first. Director of Operational Resilience, he repeated, as if testing how it sounded. Effective immediately. Yes, Evelyn confirmed. And reporting structure? To me, she replied. That detail shifted something subtle but significant. Victor's authority had not vanished, but it had been rerouted. Daniel remained steady. He wasn't interested in territory. He was interested in structure. A board member leaned forward. We'll need a formal announcement. We'll make one, Evelyn said. But we won't dramatize it. Victor gave a tight smile. Hard to avoid drama after today, Evelyn met his look calmly. Then perhaps we should normalize competence. The board meeting adjourned without fanfare. One by one, members filed out, some offering Daniel quiet nods. Not applause, not flattery, just acknowledgement. When the doors finally closed, only 3 people remained in the room. Victor adjusted his jacket, smoothing invisible wrinkles. "You understand, this creates tension," he said to Daniel. "Tension already existed," Daniel replied evenly. Victor studied him carefully now, not with dismissal, but with recalculation. "You could have leveraged your past earlier, avoided years in maintenance." "I didn't want leverage," Daniel said. "I wanted time." "For what?" "For my daughter." The answer wasn't strategic. It was human. Victor's expression softened for a fraction of a second before hardening again. "This isn't personal. It always is," Daniel said quietly. "When collapse affects people," Evelyn stepped between them, not physically, but in tone. "Enough." Victor exhaled slowly. "Very well. Congratulations, Director." It wasn't warm. But it wasn't mocking either. After he left, the room felt lighter. Evelyn walked to the window, looking down at the atrium where employees moved between departments. "You didn't ask for this," she said. "No." "And you could have humiliated him in there." Daniel shook his head. "That wouldn't fix anything." A faint smile touched her lips. "You chose restraint. I chose stability." She turned back toward him. "I sat in that folding chair because I needed to see what we overlook. Today confirmed it." He held her gaze. "Leadership isn't where power looks. It's where responsibility lives." The words lingered between them. She nodded once. "You'll have the flexibility you asked for." Recitals included. "Thank you." It wasn't gratitude for a promotion. It was gratitude for understanding. Later that afternoon, an internal memo circulated across the company. Operational Resilience Leadership Update. It outlined the recalibration, credited Daniel's framework, and emphasized cross-department transparency moving forward. No inflated language. No corporate theatrics. Within hours, subtle shifts appeared across floors. Department heads requested system briefings from resilience teams. Junior analysts asked questions they might have once withheld. Even facilities staff walked with a slightly straighter posture. Marcus caught Daniel near the service elevator. "So, do we still call you for broken vents?" Daniel gave him a small grin. "Always. You're serious?" "Systems are systems." Marcus shook his head, laughing softly. "Guess some things don't change. Some shouldn't," Daniel replied. Across the building, Victor stood in his office overlooking the skyline. He replayed the day in silence. His authority hadn't been stripped, but it had been challenged by competence rather than confrontation. That distinction unsettled him more than rebellion would have. He picked up his phone, hesitated, then sent a short message to Daniel. "We'll need to align on quarterly projections tomorrow." A pause. Then a reply, of course. No bitterness, no triumph, just forward motion. As the sun lowered against the glass towers, the building's lights flickered on in measured rows. From the outside, Harrow Biotech looked unchanged, sleek, controlled, confident. Inside, something foundational had shifted, not in hierarchy alone, in recognition. Daniel packed his bag at a reasonable hour. No emergency alerts, no cascading failures, just steady amber lines across integration dashboards. He stepped into the service elevator, not because he had to, but because it was still the most direct path down. The doors slid closed. For the first time, the ride didn't feel like descent, it felt like balance. The elevator doors opened onto the lobby, and Daniel stepped out into the early evening light filtering through glass panels. The building behind him hummed with quiet efficiency. No alarms, no frantic consultants, no fractured projections. Just steady systems and people moving with renewed intention. His phone buzzed in his hand. A message from Lila, 5 minutes, Dad. "Don't be late." He smiled. "I won't," he murmured to himself, already quickening his pace toward the parking garage. The drive across town felt different than it had a day before. The skyline no longer loomed as something separate from his life, it simply existed. A place he worked, not a place that owned him. The school auditorium lights glowed warmly when he arrived. Parents clustered near the entrance again, adjusting coats, carrying flowers. The scent of polished floors and faint popcorn drifted through the open doors. He stepped inside, heart steady. This time, the seat labeled Lila's dad wasn't empty. He sat before the curtain rose. When Lila walked onto the stage and scanned the audience, she didn't hesitate. Her eyes found him instantly. A grin spread across her face, small but radiant. He lifted his hand in a subtle wave. The first notes of her performance floated outward, clear, confident, unshaken. She didn't glance toward the aisle this time. She didn't wonder who might fill the seat. She knew. Daniel listened without distraction. No vibrating phone, no mental recalculations, just music and the quiet pride that comes from keeping a promise. Somewhere near the back of the auditorium, unnoticed by most, Evelyn stood briefly before slipping into a rear seat. She didn't make herself known, she didn't need to. She watched the father who had recalibrated her company sit exactly where he belonged. On stage, Lila finished with a strong final chord. Applause surged again, louder than before. Daniel stood with the rest of the parents, clapping until his palms stung. After the recital, Lila ran into his arms. "You made it. I told you I would." She studied him closely. "You look different," he chuckled softly. "How?" "Like, taller." He laughed quietly. Must be the shoes, but he knew what she meant. Later that night, back at the tower, lights still glowed in executive offices. Integration models continued stabilizing under the staggered buffer framework. Departments collaborated differently. Conversations felt less guarded. Victor stood alone near the boardroom window looking down at the city. The events of the past 2 days had forced him to confront something uncomfortable, that authority without awareness was fragile. He didn't like the lesson. But he understood it. Evelyn closed her office door and reviewed the final investor metrics. Stability confirmed. Market response steady. She allowed herself a rare, quiet exhale. Leadership, she realized, wasn't about always being first in the room. Sometimes it was about knowing when to step into someone else's seat and when to offer it back. Across town, Daniel tucked Lila into bed. "You won't miss the next one, right?" She asked sleepily. "No," he said firmly. "I won't." After she drifted off, he sat at the edge of her bed for a moment longer, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing. He had been an executive once. He was again in a different form. But titles weren't the point. Presence was. The next morning, Harrow Biotech's internal newsletter ran a simple headline. "Resilience is built from the ground up." No dramatic portraits, no staged photographs, just acknowledgement. And that was enough. This wasn't a story about missing a recital. It was about what happens when power chooses to see, and when humility chooses to lead. If you have another story title in mind, ask me for it. Subscribe and don't miss our next story. Single dad returned a lost wallet. The woman he helped bought his house the next day. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?